Now, can you hear me? Please raise your hands if you can hear me. Now, to continue with the history of the spread of the mind-only school into China, between the what is the reason why the Dharma characteristic school that flourished in China and the mind-only view, why are they said to be the difference? Janet has said that Master Paramita taught the thought of Sthiramati, while Xuanzang taught the thought passed down from Dignaga, Svabhava, and Dharmapala. And so this is what is said, but there is a question as whether Paramata was later than Sthiramati. There are those who assert that he was. Likewise, if we look at the texts by Svabhava, if we look at the works of Svabhava that are preserved in Tibetan, as well as the text preserved in Chinese, those of Dharmapala and so forth, we can see that that makes it difficult for us to necessarily say that there is a connection between Svabhava and Dharmapala and Xuanzang's. Likewise, when you take a look at the difference in text of the Indian mind-only tradition, there are many different accounts, differences in their thought. And so this is something that researchers are currently looking at. But the whole situation is not entirely clear. But in the future, it's not just... The researchers are looking at the development of thought in the Tibet as it is in the Tibetan scriptures. And so this is another thing that is important for us to keep in mind and know. So next, I would like to speak about the Dharma characteristic school and what is the reason why it was given that name, the Dharma characteristic school? If you call it the Dharma characteristic school or the school of the phenomenal appearances, and the reason why it's called this is, as I explained earlier. Oh no, what's happened? It's stopped again. So as I explained before, there are the three mind-only schools that I mentioned before, the 10-level school, the compendium tradition, and the Dharma characteristic schools. And the one we are currently discussing is the Dharma characteristic schools. Now, this is called, the reason why it is called the Dharma characteristic school, or the school of phenomenal appearances. In order to understand this, we need to first think about how when we humans examine external things, or even the entire universe, so the way we think about that, or we need to understand in terms of between the nature and appearances. When we're examining how do we examine the appearances, there are two primary ways that we examine the appearances. And so it's important for us to understand the difference between these two different ways of looking at. The first is taking a look at the subtle aspect of phenomena, or then there is substantial aspect. So examining. And if we take a look into, and both of these are looking at different levels of their substance. So they come to the levels of substantial. So on the subtle level, so when we're talking about atoms, all of the gross external things are comprised of atoms. They're made of smaller things, the atoms and so forth. So many atoms and so forth are combined to create larger objects. So when we look at the coarse external objects, so there's when we look at these atoms that are the basis that are combined to make the coarse external phenomena, then so there's really extremely tiny things, the tiniest of things, and we find that thing, and that is what we call the substantia, the subtle aspect of things. And then that subtle aspect also has a substantial nature. It has if you think about what is it made of, what is the material it is, the stuff that is it made out of, and that is what we call like the substratum of things. So whether to take a look and to think about the atoms or the substratum of it in terms of the substance that we make, this is taking a look at the still looking at things in a material aspect, so not going beyond that. Now, the second way of looking at things is looking at the nature of appearances. When we talk about looking at the nature of appearance, it's like saying, is there a nature of things that is separate from outside of the nature? For example, these days, when some examine either saying that the waters, that the entire world is made of atoms or made of water and so forth. Or they talk about it as making the many different extremely subtle particles like quarks or electrons. And so they have this, when they're talking about who is this, what does this, which of these two does this man look? The first of them, because it's looking at the different levels of substance, and it's not going beyond that level of substantial. Now, if there's some sort of other nature that is behind that, or a different other nature that is other than that appearances, and that's also something that we need to examine. That would be the second way of examining the nature. And if we understand this point, then we can understand what this Dharma characteristic school is called, the Dharma characteristic, the characteristics of phenomena, or the appearances of phenomena. And so for that reason, the Mindful School founded by Xuanzang Kuiji is given the name the Dharma Characteristic School. It's because this school investigates the characteristics of dharmas or phenomena, or the manner in which they are. And because of that, they're called the School of the Nature, the characteristics of dharmas or phenomena. But if you were to be really precise about the name, if we'd be extremely precise about this, this Dharma characteristics phenomena, then the Dharma characteristics school doesn't actually show the actual meaning. The actual name of this is the School of the Nature and Appearances of Phenomena. And if we give it that sort of a name, then it would be a better name. Now, the reason for this is that in this tradition, there's the difference between the appearances and the nature, the distinction between the aspect and nature. They divide these two and say, what is the nature? What is the appearance? What is the way things are? What is their nature? And identifying that is one of the most important aims of this tradition. And so for this reason, when we talk about it as the tradition of the nature and appearances, and if we talk about it in terms of the particular name that we give this, as we talked about, is the examination of nature and appearances. So the appearances are the images of the things that they appear to us, and the nature refers to the nature of those things. When we examine this nature, And so this school examined this and this question. So it engages in both so looking it is looking at the nature of the images of things or the appearances of things. And so it's not only thinking it is not okay to think that it's only looking at the nature, the appearances themselves. It's distinguishing the nature and the appearances and developing its philosophy based on that. And that is why can be called the school of the nature and appearances of phenomena. Generally, one of the most important aims of the mind-only philosophy is, as I said, is to identify the way things appear and the way things are distinctly and individually, right? When we talk about it, we aren't able to distinguish how things appear from how they actually are. We aren't able to distinguish their appearance and their nature. But the aim of the mind-only philosophy is to say, what is the way things appear? What are the confused appearances? What are the images, the cognitive images in a confused mind? And what is the nature? So does it recognizing, distinguishing properly the way things appear and the way they actually are? This is one of the most important aims of the mind only. But the basis for this thinking, or the starting point is the way things appear, or the cognitive image, because without that, we can't appear there. We aren't able to identify how things appear. But the way things appear to our mind every day, things appear in that fortune. So we have to begin with that appearance or the cognitive image. That's how we have to begin. So it's how things appear to us, how we focus on it, how we direct our attention towards it, and what is the cognitive image of the object we need to identify. We need to use our actual experience and examine the nature of things. And so from this aspect, you consider the mind-only philosophy is similar to science. And basically, it means it has a logical basis and a nature of reasoning. Another perspective is that the mind-only philosophy is extremely complicated. It's very vast. It's profound. It's extremely precise and detailed. So the mind-only philosophy has like a nature of a philosophical tradition. It's basically a philosophical, and it's like this is sort of Buddhist school that it is. And so for this reason, we talk about the mind. It's difficult for people to understand the mind-only school because it has such a strong philosophical bent and such a strong physical nature that if you haven't done a little bit of study, it's difficult to immediately understand it right away. And so that's the reason why it's called the Dharma Characteristic School. Now, next, I would like to speak about the spread of the mind-only philosophy in Japan. So actually, before I begin, I'd like to give an explanation of the spread of the mind-only in China through a diagram. Now, the source of it is, of course, that it spread from India to China. Now, the origin of the mind-only school is the original is the 10 level school that was passed down from Bodhidharma and Ratnamati. And now this had the southern tradition and the northern tradition, these two traditions, right? Then there's these Master Paramartha, the Chinese master, the Master Paramartha went to Paramartha and he translated the compendium, and this led to the compendium of Mahayana school. And then the school of the 10 levels, the 10 stages school, then the southern tradition merged into the compendium school and into the Avatamsaka school. The northern tradition went into the compendium school, and the southern tradition part went into the Mahayana school, and some went into the Avatamsaka school. And then the third is the Xuanzang. Now, I thought maybe I should explain why I wrote it this way in Tibetan. If we look in the Tibetan tenjur, there's the name Xunsang appears in this, but the way it's written there is Xiangsang. It's spelled with a hi at a ya, or hy in English writing. So that's how it's written in the Tanjur. So this is the school of the Dharma characteristic school that was passed down from Xunsang. The Dharma characteristic school later spread to Japan. So next, to speak about how it spread to Japan. Now, with regard to the lineage of the transmission of the Dharma characteristic school to Japan, is that there are many Japanese masters who went to China to study the Dharma characteristic school. And so there are basically four different ways, or four different transmissions of this to Japan. And the first of these is Dosho. So it's Dosho, who in 653 went to Tang, or China, and studied the mind only with Tang Xunsang and Kuei-ji. And so then in 661, he returned to his homeland and spread the mind only philosophy there. And then there's Chitatsu, who went in 658 to Tang and studied with Xunsang and Kuei-ji. Now, it's not clear from the histories when he returned to Japan. Now, the third was Chiho and Chiran. So there's Chihon, Chuan, and Chiyu. These all arrived in Tang in 703 and studied with the third masters of the Dharma characteristic schools, Chuzhou. So they spent several years there studying mind only. They spent many years in Japan, and in either 705 or 76, they returned to Japan. Now, the fourth master was Gunbo, who arrived in Tang in 717. And he also, again, studied with Zhizhou, the third master of the Dharma characteristic schools. And he later returned to his own land in 735. And so because of their activity, the Dharma characteristic school was introduced and spread widely in Japan. It spread very widely. Now, during the Nara period, during the Nara period in Japan, so the Nara period lasted from 710 to 794 in the Common Era. So that period is called the Nara period. And so during that time, there was the southern capital, Nanto, where Buddhism spread very widely. And so there, one of the types of Buddhist philosophy that was present there was this Dharma characteristic school. Now, the first holder of this was the master Dosho, who stayed at the Gango temple. And so then the fourth of the master, the Kofuku, lived, or the fourth master Genbo, then went to the Kofuku temple, and he spread the mind-only philosophy there. And so because of this, the mind-only philosophy really developed very rapidly. And so the early of these is called the Southern Temple, and the latter one was called the Northern Temple. And so between these two different temples, in terms of the mind-only philosophy, there's a great debate and a great rivalry between these two. And likewise, there are also many famous scholars who wrote many great treatises. And this situation continued until the Edo period. So this flourished until the 1800s. Now, in the actual time, the Japanese scholars from the earliest to the modern times, the Japanese scholars have seen the mind-only philosophy Right, so if I explain it like this, or if I show you this, they had the tradition of studying the mandala together with the treasure of Abhidharma, and they saw this as like the it's like the basis of Buddhism, and in particular during the Edo period. Now, the Edo period was from the 17th to the 19th century. So it was during this period that period is what is called the Edo period. And for that time, no matter what lineage you are, whether you are a mind only or not, or whatever tradition you were from, all of the monks would then go to the city of Nara. So this is the southern capital, right? They would go to Nara, and they'd study mind only and the treasure of Abhidharma. And it said that they would spend 3 years studying mind only and 8 years studying Abhidharma, as I mentioned the other day. So 3 years on mind only, 8 years on mind only. And what this shows is that if you really thought you wanted to study the mind only properly, then you had to spend 11 years studying it. And so because of this, we can see that at that time, studying mind only was actually very difficult because you had to spend a long time to study. You had to spend such a long time, go through a lot of effort and hardship to do it. And the main reason for this is that the mind only is an extremely systematized Buddhist philosophy. And in historical terms, the mind only view is like the among the fundamental philosophies is the most sophisticated, the most broadest presentation of philosophy. And so for that reason, you had to spend so long and go through a lot of effort and hardship to study it. And if we think about it at a time, when we talk about treasury in the mind only by these is at that time in Japan, the treasury means the treasure of Abhidharma by Vasubandu, and mind only means the proof of the mind only by Dharmapala and other mind only texts. So when you talk about the treasury in the mind only philosophy, there's a name of a common name that I mentioned. And so this is what we call the science of nature and appearance, talking about the nature and the appearance. So when we talk about the nature appearance, as I said before, shouldn't we talk about the appearance needs the nature phenomena and then the appearance means the phenomena that appear. And so the phenomena that appear, like the particulars of the Dharma that appear, and then the common natures like of all phenomena is the nature of phenomena. Now, the treasure of Abhidharma, basically, it combines all of the phenomena, noble phenomena, 75, which are then good in the 5 bases of the noble. So first you have 75 different categories, and then all of these can be combined into 5 bases of the noble. And so these 5 bases of the noble are form, mind, mental factors, non-concurrent formations, and non-composites. So these are the 5 bases of the noble. So 5 categories. And these 5 categories are, if we combine them, so if we think of how many different, among these, they're again divided phenomena into 75. For example, so you have 11 categories of form and so forth. And in that way, if you list all of them down, if you count how many there are in each of the different categories, then you have 72 different categories of phenomena. You have the 5, the 5 bases of the noble and the 75 categories of phenomena. And in the mind-only tradition, how do they categorize things? They do assert that they're the 5 bases of phenomena, and then they say that there are 100 different types of dharmas. And now there is a text, as I mentioned, the 100 gates of the dharmas. It's in the Tenjura, all right? It was translated from the Chinese. I think some of the bits of the translation are not so not so good. Now I'm not sure. No, I've thought I should retranslate it, but if I translate it, it's unclear whether it's going to become easier to understand or more difficult. But in any case, sometimes I think I should retranslate it. In any case, this talks about the different, talking about the a classification of phenomena. So because you could call it a school of the taxonomy of the Dharma. So this is like that's another name that can also be given to the mind only as well. And if we talk about it, the mind only as well, it can also be talked about as talking about the taxonomy of Dharma. It's actually the main reason why it's called this is the reason why it's called this. There's in China there's called the Chante school. And the main thought of the school is that it basically explains phenomena. In terms of the essence, it explains the nature. And then in relation to that, they called the Dharma characteristics school that examines the appearances of things. And this is not the Tiantai school, or excuse me, if we take a look in terms of the Dharma character school, it's a school that's distinguishing the way things appear and the way they are. So it's a school that distinguishes the nature and appearances of phenomena. Actually, when I talk about the appearances of phenomena, we could also give that name of the appearance of phenomena to the Abhidharma, but at that time, the main reason why the Dharma characteristic school is that in relation to those who compared it to the schools that examined primarily the nature, the mind only was therefore called the school that primarily talks about the appearances of phenomena. So basically, another thing is that in terms of the Mahayana, the mind only is like a list of the categorization of mind only phenomena. They give a very broad Mahayanic taxonomy of phenomena. So for that reason, the mind only school is called this school, the name, the Dharma characteristics, and was from one perspective because it was taking the Mahayana as the basis, and so therefore, then the treasury of Abhidharma was not given that name. Another part that is similar between the two, as I said before, is that both the treasury and the mind only speak about the different types of phenomena, so they're very similar. But the difference between the two of them is that in the Abhidharma, they say that the three times exist substantially. In mind only have the view of emptiness, or the emphasize the ultimate nature of the way things are. And so all the dualistic appearance of the apprehended and the apprehender are imaginary. Now, of course, I can speak about this when I speak about the difference between the false image and true image of schools. I'll speak about this in detail, so I don't need to speak about it too much now. Basically, in brief, the mind only is given that name because they assert that all external phenomena are actually appearances to the mind. But later, in Japan, there are many different mind schools in Japan. And the way they looked at the mind only view is they thought that the mind only school of view is not the ultimate view. The reason why it was not the ultimate view is the Dharma characteristic school divides the methods to achieve liberation into three different vehicles. It says that ultimately there are three different vehicles. It makes that presentation. Likewise, it asserts that there are some sentient beings who will not achieve Buddhahood. In dividing the five families, it says that there is with the cutoff potential or the cutoff family, and so they will not achieve Buddhahood. And that does not accord with the thought of the Avatamsaka, others which say that ultimately there is one vehicle. Likewise, also the Tiantai school and the Avatampa school say that there is Alsan because Buddha entrance. It does not accord with that. For that reason, the mind-only school was said by the other schools to be only a provisional mind-only teaching. It's not the ultimate mind-only teaching. It is only a provisional mind-only teaching. It's not the ultimate view of this. And so basically, its position was demoted because it was not the highest or the best view. It was demoted. And so when we said that the mind was not the ultimate view, that it was the only a provisional reason, a provisional mind view, and the reason for this, and so one strange reason is based on there's a Japanese scholar named Takasaki Jikido, and what he says is that there was Fatsang, the third upholder of the Avatamsaka school. His another name is called Shensho, and he made a refutation of the mind only. And he was very influential. He was the third holder of the Avatamsaka lineage, and he was also a very influential master. And he made a critique of the mind only. Likewise, in Japan, there was a master called Saicho, who was very important. Another name was Dongyo Daishu. And so, and there's a great controversy with them over the nature of Buddhahood. And so for that reason, the mindfulness was therefore taken as like a basis, or it's like a basis of Buddhism, but it was not the most profound view of Buddhism. And for this reason, it is not the ultimate view of Buddhism. And so one reason is that at that time, the influential masters in the school did not view the mind-only thought or its view as a very, they did not view it in a positive manner. Then around the end of the 19th century, during the Meiji era, so this is the Meiji era in Japan. And so when this happened, it is like in terms of this common era, this is in the 19th century. During that time, Europeans began to use new methods to research Indology and research texts. And they also began research into the Sanskrit manuscripts and the original Buddhist texts of Indian Buddhism. And so at that point, there's a lot of talk about there's a big change in the people viewed that before people had said it was not the ultimate view, but people began to change their views of it. And the reason is that they found many Sanskrit manuscripts of the original mind-only texts, and they edited them and created new texts. And this is very influential. Likewise, there are also the mind-only treatises in the Tibetan traditions, in the Tibetan translations, also became spread very widely internationally. And so for this reason, people began to take a new interest in the mind only. For example, at that time, there was a French scholar whose name is Sylvain Lévy. How do you say? His name is Sylvain Levy. He's the one on top. And there's his picture is on top, so that's Sylvain Levy. And then the one below is a Belgian scholar called Louis de la Vallée-Poussin. And he was a Belgian scholar. So the one on top is Levy. He looks a little bit like Einstein, doesn't he? He really looks like Einstein. So he's probably the mind-only Einstein. So they were at the beginning of the 20th century. They published a lot of writings and a lot of translations. So for instance, Louis de Vallée knew Pali and Tibetan and many other languages. And so it's basically he was a real polymath. And so at the beginning of the 20th century, they published many writings and many translations. And because of them, the traditional mind-only views were then introduced to the European world. And because of their activity, there became an international study of mind-only, new research into the mind-only all over the world. And at the same time, then all of a sudden, people developed new interest in it in Japan as well. And so the people took new interest in Japan, and at that time there were the two scholars who began this, who had at a real high level. There are two of them. One is Ui Hakuju. So the other of these, so the first, Ui Hakuju is the lower one. Ui Hakuju was one of the scholars, and the one on top is Yamaguchi Susumu. Yamaguchi Susumu. Yamaguchi Susumu and Ui Hakuju led research into the Sanskrit manuscripts. They published many publications on these. Likewise, there are many falls in a way that was unprecedented in history. There are many other scholars. It's kind of like a river flooding in the summer. You could say if there's because of their kindness and because of all the work that they did. And this is actually in comparison. This is just 100 years ago, and at that time, it was still difficult to go from one country to another, and studying language was difficult. But they disregarded all of these difficulties and worked hard. And because of this, they established new ways of studying the mind-only view in the current day. And so that is a brief description of how the mind-only spread to Japan. So next, I'd like to speak about how Buddhism spread to Korea. So these days, everyone says Korea. Everyone likes to like Korean films, right? But they don't really take much interest in Korean Buddhism. So these days, so I think I'd like to speak about the spread of Buddhism and mind only to Korea. So here it's got the Dharmakaya School, or another name for it is the Tseun School. Tseun is one of the names for Kuei-ji. Since Kuei-ji founded it, then it's called the Tseun School after one of his names. Now, another thing that we need to particularly take interest in is in one person. And this is a student of Xuanzang called Wenchuk. So Wenchuk. So this is Xuanzang's disciple Wenchuk. Wenchuk. He was a Korean. These days would say he was a Korean person, but in that time they didn't call Korea Korea. They called it Shilla. So they called it the kingdom of Shilla. They called it Shilla. So some people say that Wonchok was Xuanzang's student. Some others say that he was not Xuanzang's student, but Xuanzang's a Dharma friend. In any case, Wonchok and Kuei-ji were like they're right and left hand. It's like so basically, like we'd say, so the right hand and left hand. And so they're like the people that you relied on most heavily, who did everything you wanted them to do. And so Wonchok, before Master Xuanzang had returned to China, Wonchok had gone to China, and he was also very well known in study of the 10 levels, and as well as in the Compendium of Muhammad. And he was well known at that time in the capitals of Chang'an. He was very well renowned in that area. And after Xuanzang returned to China, then Wonchok followed Xuanzang as his master, and he had a very familiar with this great Sanskrit. And Wonchok as himself also spoke Sanskrit and Tibetan, it said. He knew the languages of 6 different countries. And because of that, when Xuanzang was when Xuanzang was translating the Pajanaparamita, he was able to easily recognize what were the mistakes in the old tradition, because he'd could immediately see, and he'd point to what are the mistakes in earlier translations were. So at that point, so everyone seemed to know not only was he a monk and a student that everyone had to respect, but he was also had to recognize for having a different way of thinking and understanding. Now, there's a little bit of difference between Xuanzang and Kuei-ji, or because of Wonchok's opinions differ a little bit from Xuanzang and Kuei-ji. The reason is that he had already studied the earlier teachings on mindfulness and was very well versed in them. And because he had a great affection for them, or a great attachment to them. In any case, in terms of his view and thought, he was a little bit different from Xuanzang and Kuei-ji. Another reason, as I said, is that when Xuanzang was spending 17 years in India, Wonchok was spending a lot of time studying the 10 levels and the Paramata and the companion school, and he was very heavily influenced by Paramata, and he had a very great deep understanding of the school, the mind-only school. So Wonchok was able to had the understanding of the northern and the southern tradition. So Wonchok had a very understanding under the southern tradition. So Wonchok was able to kind of so Xuanzang and Kuei-ji had primarily emphasized the views of Dharmapala and Shilabhadra. So he was able to integrate the development of the doctrine of all the different schools. And so for that reason, there's a little bit of a difference between the mind-only schools that developed in Korea, in Shilla or Korea, and how it developed in China. So after Xuanzang passed away, following his teacher's wish, he continued to teach the mind-only doctrine at Ximing Temple. And he became a very, very famous scholar at that point. Now, during this time, there were many students Korean students who'd come to China, and they became his students. And so he had and became the great master of the Ximing Temple. This was very well known as the main master of that temple. These days, there's a commentary on the Sutra Unraveling the Tibet that's presented in the Tibetan tenure, and that probably originated from that same time and period. And while he was staying in the Ximing Temple, that Ximing Temple, that place, and that monastery, became like a hub for Korean students to come and study the mind-only view in philosophy. And because of his activity, his view in philosophy had a very strong influence in Korea and in Japan. Later in China, there was an empress. There was an empress named Zetian. She was the first empress to sit on the throne. So she was the first one, and she may have been the only one. So there's the Empress Zetian. She had great faith in Buddhism, and she had great respect for Wen Shuk. And so she requested Dharma teachings from him and considered him very important. So at that time, then there's the king of Sinmun. So at that time, is the king of Korea, or what they called at the time Shila, the king Sunmun. The king Sunmun repeatedly sent messengers to Wen Shuk to request him to return to his homeland. And he said this many times, but at that point, the Empress Wu refused to accept this. And so she didn't immediately send him. At the end, one time she allowed him to return to Korea for a brief time. So he was able to go, but then he again returned to China. And he stayed in China until the end of his life. Now, there are not many of his works remain these days, because he had a commentary on the proof of the mind only, which is considered a very important text, but now the text is no longer extant. Now, his most important text is the commentary on the Sutra Unraveling the Intent. It's a very influential, now it is in our tenure, and it takes 3 volumes, three large volumes. So generally, in China, there are commentaries on this by Paramatta, Ningfen, and Sung Fang, and other Chinese masters that were written during the Tang Dynasty, but none of them are remaining. Not one of them has survived. Only the commentary by Wen Shuk on the Sutra Unraveling the Tent has survived. None of the others from the Tang Dynasty have survived. And so this commentary is extremely important and extremely significant. Now, in the 9th century, probably during the time of the Emperor Chen, who was translated into Tibetan by Go Chudrup. Later, when Song Kangpa wrote his Essence of the Fine Explanations of the Definitive and the Expedient, he gave cited this text many times, and he did also refute it in many points, but he considered it to be very important. Actually, tomorrow, or the next time when I speak about the spread of the mind only to Tibet, I think that I'll speak about this translator, Go Chudrup, because he's really had a connection to it. So I think I need to give an introduction. So that is what we have for today. So it's probably better to leave it here today. Now, one thing I would like to say to all of you, so tomorrow is a day off. The plan is originally to have a teaching. Now, the day after tomorrow, the day after is the Chinese New Year, and it's also the Tsurpo Losar, according to the Tsurpo calculations. But when I was making the plans, I don't have the Tsurpo calendar, so I didn't have a chance to look at the calendar. So yesterday, after we announced everything, only then did someone I know say, "Oh, the Tsurpo the Tsurpo Losar and your so basically what they're saying is, I think they were saying, you weren't paying attention to the Tsurpo calendar, you're not giving us a Losar. But this year, the Tibetan Losar and the Tsurpo Losar. So if I look at it, I had nothing, I couldn't do anything other than say that that they conflicted. That's sort of low side. It's also the Chinese New Zealand. So I think it's better to take that day off. No, I'm not going to take a day off actually, because I need to research the spread of mind only um, into Tibet. I have to do this because there's no one who's written a summary of this in Tibet, and so I have to look through all these different texts, look through this. So I'm not going to be able to take a day off myself. But if you all take a day off, it's better. So tomorrow the day off, and the day after and then the day after that will recommence. We will have our teachings. Okay, so that is basically it. Now please recite the dedication prayers. Still have one thing I need to say. So the day after tomorrow is the Chinese New Year. And as I said before, it's also the New Year according to the Tsurpa calculations. And that's the day after tomorrow. So to take this opportunity to wish all of the Chinese Dharma friends who are listening over the internet to offer you a happy Chinese Lunar New Year. I hope that you all are healthy in this new year, that all of your affairs go well. And that all of the obstacles, internal, external, internal, may be pacified, and that everything go well for you, and that your Dharma practice go well.